This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, for the brilliant introduction. And it's been such an honor over the past several years to work with you and with the range of wonderful collaborators you've already mentioned. And so it brings me so much happiness to share this work with you because it represents so much. I'll turn on my video for a brief moment so you can see my Indian couture, but I'll turn it off to preserve my internet connectivity. But yeah, it brings me so much joy to share this because it represents a lot of work that I've done, but also a huge amount of effort on the part of hundreds of smallholder farmers in India. And so I'm really glad that you'll get to share in their journey as well. So without further ado, I will be giving this talk today on participatory research as a mycotoxin surveillance and intervention strategy for resource-poor Indian communities. And so just to give a bit of structure for today's talk, I'll be walking you through 3 guiding questions which are closely aligned with the 3 dissertation chapters that are coming out of my India work. Firstly, I'll be asking, how are mycotoxin risk factors distributed within and across food systems? And secondly, how do you identify intervention options based on those risk factors that are appropriate for meeting local needs? And thirdly, once you've identified localities that are vulnerable to mycotoxin contamination, how do you translate identified need into meaningful actions that can result in safer, sustainable food systems? And so before we dive into what I've been working on, I'll just give a bit of background on mycotoxins for those who don't already have familiarity with this concept. So mycotoxins are potent fungal secondary metabolites that contaminate a range of food and feed commodities and are thought to contaminate upwards of 25% and even up to 80% of the global food supply, according to some estimates. And these toxins are associated with massive monetary losses, both as a result of their influence in crop productivity and trade, but also associated with their healthcare burden. Several of the more important mycotoxins result in dietary exposures that can cause adverse human health and nutrition outcomes. And the negative effects of mycotoxin exposure are most pronounced in resource-poor communities, particularly in the tropical developing world, where conditions are at the same time most amenable to fungal proliferation, and also these communities are often least equipped to take action against contamination events. And so while there are many, many mycotoxins of importance, I'll be focusing this talk today, and I've focused my dissertation research on 3 particularly important mycotoxins. Aflatoxin, which is produced by Aspergillus flavus, and is commonly associated with maize and groundnuts. Fumonisin, produced by Fusarium verticillioides, which is commonly associated with maize, millets, and sorghum, and dioxynivalenol, or DON, a trichothece mycotoxin produced by Fusarium graminearum, which is commonly associated with wheat and maize. So mycotoxins really can accumulate at various nodes along the food value chain. From even the very earliest seedling stages, mycotoxigenic molds can start to associate with developing plants. And up through grain filling, crops in the field are susceptible to grain molds, which can result in mycotoxin accumulation. And furthermore, contaminated produce can continue to become mycotoxins in the storage environment if storage conditions are suitable for continued proliferation of these fungi. And so while mycotoxins can and do accumulate at these various nodes along the food value chain, those nodes are also complemented by a range of intervention opportunities that can be injected at each point. For example, seedling molds can be controlled by good agronomic practices. Grain molds can be managed by application of timely inputs, such as fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation. Storage molds can be prevented by proper drying and good food hygiene. And then, of course, prior to consumption, careful sorting out of off-type grains can be a final preventative measure, protecting food preventing food from entering the diet. And so with this background underway, let's dive into the first question that I'll be talking about. How are mycotoxin risk factors distributed within and across food systems? So to tackle this question, back in my first days as a TCI scholar in 2016, I conducted an exploratory survey evaluating food management practices and aflatoxin contamination status across 4 diverse food system contexts in India: Maharajganj district in the north, Munger district in the north, Kandhamal in the east, and Mahabubnagar in the south. And so these diverse food systems have really rich and distinct cropping systems which correspond to distinct risk profiles for aflatoxin accumulation. And so one of the outputs of this survey that I sought to develop was a system for assessing aflatoxin risk level at in households across these Indian food systems. And so the aflatoxin survey allowed us to determine that between 30 and 80% of households across these diverse food systems yielded samples that were contaminated with aflatoxin. And so you can see here in this middle figure here, the blue portion of these bars corresponds to the proportion of households with no aflatoxin, and the red portion of the bar corresponds to households with samples that had detectable aflatoxin. And you can see that across these different regions, there were different levels. For example, in Mahabubnagar, 82% of households yielded a detectable sample. And so we wanted to dive deeper and understand what features of the food system give rise to these differential experiences in household level contamination. And as we expected, the differential susceptibilities of different commodity types is playing an undeniably important role. So on the x-axis here, we can see the 4 districts. And then if you look at the panels for groundnut, maize, and sorghum, as highlighted here, we're seeing that in the districts where these commodities were present in the food system, we observed rather high levels of contamination, whereas pearl millets, oil seeds, pulses, and wheat had very much negligible levels of aflatoxin contamination. Rice was sort of an interesting case, as it is such a major staple food across these food systems. We observed frequent contamination in rice, but very few samples that exceeded the Indian regulatory legal limit of 15 parts per billion. And so we can conclude from this that commodity really is playing an important role in shaping the detection outcomes. But if we even zoom in farther towards sample detection rates, we can see across the 4 districts, Maharajganj, Munger, Kandhamal, and Mahabubnagar, that within each commodity type, the detection rates were quite moderate. And so we were really keen to understand, what is resulting in a red sample, a contaminated sample versus a blue sample? And are there features of the food systems that we can identify that might give rise to a detected sample more often than not? And so we already had some idea of the major drivers of aflatoxin risk. We are not the first people to want to understand this, and there's a rich literature pointing to different risk factors for aflatoxin accumulation. Particularly, we know that pre-harvest agroclimatic features are very important determinant of aflatoxin levels. For example, there are known relationships between drought, temperature, and soil nutrition and aflatoxin status. I'm showing this figure here where in this study they compared groundnuts produced without drought stress, as indicated by this red dashed line, compared to groundnuts grown at varying levels of drought stress. And we can see that the population density of Aspergillus flavus is significantly higher in groundnuts produced under drought stress conditions. And so, there's an abundance of evidence pointing toward these pre-harvest agroclimatic features as important determinants of aflatoxin. But a sort of a disadvantage of considering these as intervention opportunities is that it's quite hard to act against agroclimatic realities in a way that can be achieved by smallholder farmers. For example, if a farmer wants to combat drought conditions, they might be interested in irrigation infrastructure, which is often very expensive, sometimes more expensive than the ordinary smallholder farmer might be able to afford. And so we wanted to understand to what extent post-harvest management, and particularly post-harvest behaviors, might be useful for identifying intervention opportunities that come at lower cost to farmers than combating the elements pre-harvest. So it's already known that agronomic practices, post-harvest practices, and culinary practices all influence aflatoxin exposures in their own ways. And there's been, on a case-by-case basis, some demonstrated relationships between socioeconomic status and mycotoxin outcomes. And so we really hypothesized that some low-cost behavioral practices might be targeted for aflatoxin interventions in a way that's accessible for farmers. And so in this study, we really had three major goals. First, to understand the dynamics of the food systems that were surveyed in this context, but also to relate toxin status to what we recorded in the household level survey, the crop protection practices, the food preservation practices, and other management tools farmers were using and how those related to risk status. And ultimately, we hope to create an index of household aflatoxin risk status. So when we think about creating a risk index, it's really a matter of predictive modeling. And so we identified 6 post-harvest related risk factors a priori and evaluated them for their associations with aflatoxin status. The full set of predictors that we considered a priori were commodity susceptibility, storage time, storage vulnerability, food preservation practices in the household, crop protection practices, and landholding status, sort of as an umbrella representation of stable wealth and resource access in the household. We used a forward stepwise logistic regression to test these variables for their associations with household aflatoxin status, and included 4 of the 6 in our index validation pipeline based on their effect size and p-values in their association with aflatoxin status. Interestingly and unexpectedly, the 2 storage related variables didn't have significant effects on aflatoxin status, but we were able to move forward with the other 4. And in order to compile an index, we developed a scoring system for each of these 4, where each element of risk was given a score from 2 to 5 according to threshold values derived from the literature. And we represented the index in 2 different ways. First, a summative composite score by adding up together all of the 4 risk index components. And secondly, a disaggregated score that includes each of the 4 predictors as separate covariates in the prediction model. And there are pros and cons to either approach. The major advantage of a summative composite score is that it can be easily calculated and immediately interpretable by even someone without any modeling experience, assuming it has adequate predictive value. But then the advantage of the disaggregated modeling approach is that it, at least theoretically, has more potential to yield higher accuracy in its predictions. So what we found in a repeated five-fold cross-validation is that both the composite and the disaggregated scores predicted aflatoxin detection status in these households moderately well. We achieved 61% sensitivity or true positive rates and 65% specificity or true negatives using the composite summative score, whereas the disaggregated score, which modeled all four as separate covariates, was able to increase the sensitivity by 10 percentage points compared to the composite score, whereas the specificity was statistically unchanged. And so what we're seeing here is that these risk factors really do predict aflatoxin status in households moderately well, but it isn't perfect. And so this may be useful just for an exploratory risk assessment tool. And ideally, these would be considered together with those also important pre-harvest agroclimatic drivers, models upon which have also achieved 60 to 70% classification accuracy. And I suspect that in future iterations of predictive modeling for aflatoxin status, combining both pre-harvest and these post-harvest indicators would achieve higher levels of classification accuracy than either could realize independently. So I'll give you a sense for how we can apply this index in context. So we constructed a predicted probability curve of the probability of detection at various levels of the index using our prediction model. And we determined that there's a really definitive cutoff at around the value of 17 on the index scale, above which more than 50% of or you have a higher than 50% chance of having a detected sample in your household. And when we compare this to what we actually observed in the households, we can see indeed that when a household had an index value greater than 17, 3/4 of those households had yielded a detectable sample, compared to just 35% of households in this top panel B that yielded a detectable sample with scores less than 17. And so we were able to identify a reasonable cutoff as an indicator of household risk status using this system. And we can even go beyond this and think about how these correspond to local risk profiles. So in panel A, we're seeing blobs that correspond to the numerous households that were included in this survey, where the colors correspond to the cumulative risk index score, where lighter colors are lower risk households and darker colors are darker risk households. And we can see that within each locality, we're able to see a range of low to high risk scores. And then in panel B, what we're seeing is the individual components of those risk scores on average for each of the 4 locations. And in this way, we can see which components of risk are more important drivers of aflatoxin than others. So the t-tests each one component against the average of all components, just to see which ones contribute more or less than average to a local risk profile. And here in the top panel in Maharajganj, for example, we can see that the crop susceptibility score contributed significantly less than the others to the local risk profile. And that makes sense because here in Maharajganj, the cropping system is dominated by rice and wheat, which are not necessarily susceptible commodities. And so while we're seeing comparable levels of risk across all of these locations, the individual drivers of risk across the locations are quite different. And so we can learn a lot about how to target intervention options from conceptualizing risk in this way. So a takeaway from this section is that post-harvest risk factors do indeed predict household aflatoxin status. Food systems really seem to have diverse risk profiles, and these pre-harvest or post-harvest management variables do seem to be important determinants of contamination status at the household level. And so what we've determined is that post-harvest factors, in addition to the pre-harvest factors, are useful also for prediction of aflatoxin status. So moving on to the second section, once we understand how risk factors are distributed within and across locations, how do you identify intervention options that work for a particular community of interest? So for this section, we're going to be zooming into a new location altogether, Unnao district in India's Indo-Gangetic Plains region in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And Unnao district is among the most disadvantaged districts in India from the standpoint of development status. And we selected this district because of its relatively diverse food systems to include commodities such as maize, groundnuts, and pearl millet, which are featured as regular features of the diet. And also, we wanted to situate this study in a context with a low level of baseline monitoring capacity. And because of the low development status in Unnao, that criterion was well satisfied. And a practical consideration in selecting Unnao was its proximity to one of our TCI Tarina implementation partners, GDS, located in the city of Lucknow, which is nearby. So in this district, we were focused in the post-harvest context. And so I think it's valuable to give you all an idea of what the typical Unnao storage system looks like. The most common method used to store grain in Unnao is by burying sacks of predominantly wheat and rice under haystacks of chopped rice straw. And then there are a range of alternative storage structures that are used in a spectrum of ways across the district. These earthen silos are used often for rice. Metal drums are used for wheat storage in some contexts. And then separate sacks like this are used for storage of smaller quantities, especially for maize, groundnuts, and pearl millets. And occasionally farmers opted to store their grain in stacks without the rice straw covering. So we are working in 3 different village clusters. The first of which is Hassanganj, which is primarily dominated by rice and wheat, sort of constituting a lower risk food system. And then the other 2 village clusters are in Bangarmao, which have a more diverse food system, especially in the rainy season, where rice is also supplemented by maize, groundnuts, and pearl millet. And so in this figure here, we can see the sample yield across 6 seasons. So throughout this presentation, I'll be representing the calendar year in these 6 seasons corresponding to pre-winter, winter, post-winter, pre-summer, summer, and post-summer. And so we can see that across seasons and across districts, there's quite a lot of distinction in the food system composition. And so we wanted to understand how these food system composition trends over time correspond to changes in mycotoxin contamination. And what we observed in our longitudinal survey of mycotoxins in these locations is that mycotoxin levels themselves do not exhibit much seasonal variation per se. So for aflatoxin in panel A, we analyzed groundnut, maize, pearl millet, and rice samples across the 6 seasons in all of these locations. For maize and millet, we also analyzed fumonisin B1, given the known vulnerability of these commodities to fumonisin deposition. And then in wheat, we analyzed deoxynivalenol, or DON. And as you can see here, across the time points, we didn't see a whole lot of seasonal variation in mycotoxin levels per se. However, we did see trends in detection and legal status rates. If you look here in the figure across the seasons for aflatoxin detection, you can see sort of a visible trend. And these figures represent all samples across locations and crops. For here in aflatoxin legal rates, we can also see that in the summer months or the summer seasons, a much higher proportion of samples had illegal contamination status, again, compared to the Indian legal limit of 15 parts per billion. And so we constructed generalized linear mixed models to test for these relationships of seasonal dynamics. And we found, as expected, that the detection rates didn't have any statistically significant seasonal variation as they were high throughout the calendar year. But we did see a significant effect of season on the odds of aflatoxin legal status, where samples collected in the summertime had greater odds of being illegal from a regulatory standpoint. And in fumonisin, because we were only evaluating maize and pearl millet, we weren't able to observe seasonal trends because there really were very few samples collected between pre-summer and post-summer. And we, in these models, we're also able to detect a couple of other predictors as being important drivers of contamination outcomes. And as is certainly expected, commodity arose as the most important driver of contamination status in the aflatoxin models. Where, as you can see in panels A and B, representing aflatoxin detection rates and illegal status rates for these commodities over seasons, there was a significantly higher, detection rates and illegal status rates in groundnut, maize, and millet than there were in the rice reference level. But we weren't able to see the same relationship between commodity and fumonisin, because as you can see here in panels C and D, the detection rates and illegal rates for fumonisin in both commodities were consistently high. So we're able to really see, based on these intersections of commodity and time, where and when contamination events are at their greatest. But we really wanted to explore further how these observed levels of food contamination translate into dietary exposures. So we used a standard exposure dose formula to estimate per capita daily intake in terms of per kilogram body weight per day. And we did this by using the mean mycotoxin contents for each commodity in each village in each month, multiply per capita reported commodity consumption for that commodity for that month in each household. And then divided it by an age distribution adjusted average body weight. And to gather the food consumption data, we abbreviated a previously validated tool for food frequency estimation, including portion sizes in the North Indian context. And we were interested in comparing these to the tolerable daily intake levels for aflatoxin and fumonisin. And so we can see here in this figure that consumption in terms of grams intake of these non-rice and wheat commodities was very variable across time. In Hasanganj, our lower risk environment, the only seasons where consumption of non-rice and wheat commodities was really measurable on a per capita daily intake basis were in the summer and post-summer seasons. Whereas in Bangarmao, the winter seasons had the most consumption of these susceptible commodities. And these seasonal dynamics and consumption really do track with what we're seeing in seasonal exposures to these toxins. Here I'm showing on the top Hasanganj and then Bangarmao East and Bangarmao West for each of these commodities. What is the aflatoxin B1 exposure dose attributable to each commodity at each season? And we can see in Hasanganj, the only measurable dietary exposure doses are coming from rice because of the low prevalence of groundnut, maize, and millet in these food systems. Whereas in Bangarmao, much greater proportion of dietary aflatoxin is coming from groundnut and maize, with some marked seasonal variation, and only a small fraction coming from pearl millet and rice. Those same trends are echoed in fumonisin B1 here on the right-hand side, where in Hasanganj, there was really very little dietary fumonisin exposure because of the low consumption of maize and millet in this environment. But in Bangarmao, we did see concerning levels of dietary fumonisin exposure. In some seasons, these levels exceeded the tolerable daily intake level indicated by the red line. And so we were able to see that exposures in the diet to these toxins are commodity dependent and in a season specific manner. So we can take it one step further and add together the commodity-wise exposures to observe cumulative exposures in the diet in terms of per capita daily intake. And we can see that what we observed in the commodity-wise representation is echoed here, where Hassan Ganj for both aflatoxin on the top and fumonisin on the bottom had very little dietary exposure in any season. Whereas in Bangarmau East and Bangarmau West, there were levels of dietary aflatoxin exposure that exceeded the tolerable daily intake level in every season. And in fumonisin, we did see some instances of exposures above the tolerable daily intake level, especially in Bangarmau West. And so we can really conclude that toxins are present in local food systems and are resulting in dietary exposures. We've observed that cropping systems and dietary preferences are major determinants of contamination outcomes, and that seasonal dynamics in production and consumption underpin contamination and exposure events. And one interesting revelation that has come of this is that understanding the post-harvest dynamics of in food systems reveals important pre-harvest drivers of contamination. For example, in maize, immediately after harvest, we observed that the levels of aflatoxin were very high, and those levels stayed high throughout the seasons. And so we're able to say with reasonable confidence that the interventions best suited for combating mycotoxins in maize would take place in the pre-harvest domain as opposed to the post-harvest domain. And this really prompted us to wonder whether multi-time point, multi-commodity surveillance of this nature can aid in intervention decision-making. And that takes us to this third and final study, which is how do you translate need into action? And I want to use this opportunity to convince you that while it might be, deliciously simplistic to say that blanket solutions can solve every farmer's problems, farmers' needs are actually very varied and nuanced, and therefore interventions must really be matched with priorities that are of local importance if there's any hope that they'll be adopted and sustainable over time. And one tool that we can use to identify local priorities and to conjure intervention opportunities that are aligned with local needs is participatory research. And participatory research is a co-learning process where diverse stakeholders can pool skills and address shared interests. And this technique leverages diverse sets of knowledge from all stakeholders involved, leveraging both local and scientific knowledge to identify solutions with maximal impact. And this study has really been pioneering in the use of farmer research networks, which are sort of an expansion of classical participatory research to establish informational feedback loops that are intended to enhance scalability and impact over multiple geographies. Essentially, letting the learnings in one location influence the learnings and outcomes in other locations with similar needs. So you might be wondering how, where are we situating this study? And indeed, these same villages that we saw in Unnao district were the ones that I also targeted here. So we are working in the exact same communities where we have established a farmer research network comprised of farmer groups that are interested in food preservation and crop protection. So we use participatory methods to bolster capacity and to diagnose local needs. And the output of this process was that we were able to co-design experiments together with farmer communities and implement them to test the efficacy of food safety promoting interventions. So to assess local needs, Rebecca and I actually developed this wonderful exercise in the field where we had farmers draw on a piece of paper 4 quadrants corresponding to home, grain storage, market, and farm life domains. And then we had them draw a representation of that domain from their perspective. So you see, they'll draw whatever they think their house looks like, maybe a tree. In the storage, they might draw their silo or a basket. Many times the marketplace meant money, money, money. And farm, on the other hand, was a potpourri of crops, geese, and respective other farm items that each household was interested in pursuing. And secondly, we asked them to proportionally allocate X marks to these 4 domains corresponding to the amount of time that they were to working in each of these domains, where, for example, this respondent, a farmer who has more X's in the marketplace spends more time working in the market than they would in the domestic chores, for example. And lastly, we had each farmer take a series of Post-it notes with little crop icons on them corresponding to actual bags of stored grain that they had in their storage, and place them in their storage quadrant. And crop by crop, allocate their bags based on the anticipated end use of each proportion of their sacks between home consumption, use as seed on the farm, or sale in the market, to sort of get an idea of market orientation versus subsistence orientation. And so while this exercise was incredibly useful as an exploratory tool for us, it was also an incredibly prolific learning opportunity for the farmers to conceptualize their needs and to understand the aspects of their livelihood that could be targeted by interventions. And so we actually were able to transcribe this data and come to conclusions about particular subgroups with similar needs profiles. So we transcribed all of the data from these worksheets, which took a lot of time and meticulous effort, and conducted a multiple factor analysis. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'll present it in a similar way to a principal components analysis. So basically, we were able to see on this quantitative variables factor map the coordinates of time allocation and grain allocation scores. And we were able to determine that this first dimension is essentially representing an axis of home versus non-home time allocation. And the second axis is representing home versus market economic orientation. And then if we split our population into several subgroups of interest, we can understand the extent to which these populations have predictable or unpredictable needs or interests. For example, in gender, we saw that the coordinate for female respondents was highly co-localized with the coordinate for home time and home grain, indicating that females in general had much higher affinity for domestic work time. Whereas clustering by locality actually was less informative. The clusters overlapped and coincided with the plot origin, and therefore the particular locality wasn't substantially predictive of farmers' needs. Education level, as indicated by the language in which they answered the activity, either in the native Hindi or in English, which would have been attained only by the highest educated members, we saw that those with a higher level of education than average were strongly correlated with higher proportions of market time and market allocated grain. So what we can see here is that we are able to use these farmers' input to create assemblages of farmers with distinct needs profiles. And actually this, together with the farmer activities, enabled us to form interest-based affinity groups in each village that were tasked with workshopping intervention ideas and coming up with solutions that they wanted to test. And so one of the major findings of that whole process was that grain spoilage prevention was a major concern of all the farmer groups, where hermetic storage was identified as a tractable intervention option because hermetic storage sacks are a good analog to the existing sack-based storage infrastructure. So we conducted a demonstration trial in partnership with a local agricultural science center and tested hermetic storage sacks against the conventional jute and plastic sacks in combination with a range of natural additives, from none to local neem leaves and turmeric powder as bioprotective agents. And we determined that hermetic storage far and away outperformed the conventional systems, and that the natural preservatives had really no observable effect. And you can see this visually even by examining a representative sample from the hermetic storage versus the plastic only storage, where after 8 months of storage, the hermetically stored wheat was brilliantly clean with very little damage whatsoever. Whereas the grain stored in conventional plastic was absolutely destroyed rice weevils that have thoroughly infested this system. And so this was really a wonderful local proof of concept that even in a highly contaminated environment, hermetic storage is effective in preventing insect infestation and grain damage. So we decided to extend the opportunity to our farmer participants to try this technology in their home. So we allocated 2 sacks to each household, and found that the success we found in the demonstration trial was mirrored in the household trials, where 96% of the sacks were installed properly. And after installation, 90% of respondents reported having a confident understanding of the principles of the technology. At the end of the first season of storage, 92% of the farmers reported successful preservation of grain using the hermetic technology, and 100% were interested in using the technology again in the second season. And just to sort of give a farmer testimony of how profound this experience was, one farmer reported, "In the beginning, we had no information on how to collect and keep the grains. We used to store the grains according to our wishes, and many times the grain was wasted. But I have now used hermetic sacks and kept them for a year. When I opened them, I found the grain to be clean and safe." So this is just one testimonial of many that illustrates how this technology really opened farmers' eyes to the prospects for food safety that can be achieved by a simple behavior change. And so we wanted to go a step farther and not only provide these sacks, but to establish a functional value chain for hermetic storage in the local marketplace. And to convince local vendors that this is something worth their time, we conducted a willingness to pay analysis, where we asked the farmers who had participated in the hermetic trial in the first season to identify their baseline level of need. So basically in each of these locations, on the far left, Bangarmao East, Bangarmao West, and Hasanganj, we asked them to say, at 0 rupees cost, how many sacks could you realistically use? And our estimates across the 3 districts, or the 3 village clusters rather, were between 15 and 25 sacks of baseline need. But there was a highly elastic demand for this product, where even farmers who were convinced that it worked well were willing to buy much fewer bags if the cost was more. So we asked them how many bags they would like to buy at 50 rupees, or at 100 rupees or 200 rupees each. And in all districts, there was a negative relationship between the cost and the demand. But interestingly, the trends were quite locality specific. In Bangarmao, we saw a very elastic demand, where at the highest price point, virtually no farmers were interested in buying the bags. But in Hasanganj, the demand was much more inelastic, meaning that they valued the technology more and were interested in buying it even at the highest price point. And I suspect this is because of the relative importance of wheat as a source of household income in Hasanganj relative to Bangarmao. And so ultimately, we partnered with 3 local vendors in the marketplace and established retail sales points for the hermetic bags in the local market. And despite our willingness to pay projections, which are at 50 rupees per piece, 55% of needs would have been met, or 38% of need met at 100 rupees per piece, and 15% of need met at 200 rupees per piece, we were able to install the retail sales point providing hermetic sacks at between 65 and 90 rupees per piece, but farmers were extremely reluctant to actually invest. At the end of the sales period, only less than 5% of the reported need was actually met by sales of hermetic bags in the marketplace, which was really quite a disappointing outcome, but an investment decision-making process is. And so to get to the bottom of this, we developed a cost-benefit activity to deploy in our farmer research network groups, where we enabled them to estimate monetary value of expected losses, sort of front in something that is protective could save them money later on. And while people really understood that concept, they still would rather pay less upfront, even if future losses would be greater. One farmer said, the sacks are costly. If they would have been 50 rupees each, then they would have sold a lot. A man thinks it's okay if 5 or 6 kgs of grain might go to waste, but that sacks should not be that expensive. So again, we're learning a lot about how complex farmers' investment decision-making processes are. And again, this is further evidence that blanket solutions can't really be universally applied. And so in the second year of trial activities, and I'll just wrap up with 2 quick slides and not go into great detail, we focused our next cycle of work on pre-harvest options, particularly with emphasis on cheap and accessible inputs. So we developed training programs for 3 methods and implemented a farmer-reported performance evaluation system where farmers would compare their experimental treated plots with untreated control plots identified in their same fields. And overall, across these 3 experiments, diethane M45 groundnut seed treatment, phosphate solubilizing bacterial, maize seed treatment, and trichoderma powder, we had really high levels of perceived better performance compared to the untreated controls. But when this is really a positive outcome, and we've established access points for each of these methods in the local environment, but a limitation to this is that the data are very highly qualitative because of their farmer reported nature. And really it would be necessary to have trained local enumerators for data collection in order to realize quantitative evaluation of these technologies. And that's something for future investigation. So just to conclude the 3 sections of this talk, section 1, the takeaway is that risk factors are diverse, locally specific, and associated with food system composition. In section 2, we learned that there is substantial seasonal variation in mycotoxin loads and dietary exposures, and that each locality really has specific trends that warrant particular intervention outcomes. And then in section 3, we learned that farmer research networks can deliver specialized interventions that are informed by local priorities. But a major thing to be respected about that effort was that farmers' behaviors are hard to change. And this sort of effort takes a lot of programming, attention, trust building, and careful consideration of the many complex dynamics in a smallholder food system. And so that's all I've got for you today. I just want to give acknowledgement where it's due to my committee members, Rebecca, Gary, Prabhu, and Becky, for your excellent guidance throughout this whole journey, to my colleagues at Cornell in Rebecca's lab, TCI and the TCI research group and the statistical consulting unit. Hearty thanks to my collaborator, Dr. Sudini at ICRISAT and his lab group, and Padmaja ma'am for her constant guidance from my very beginnings in India and many more there. My collaborators and comrades at TCI Tarina in Delhi and Mumbai, and then to my implementation partners, GDS in Lucknow, especially Amitabh, and the Unnao KVK, the Ag Science Center, and particularly Dr. Singh and Ratna. And most importantly, my absolutely amazing team, without which I would have been totally lost and completely unproductive. Virendra, Aditi, and Shruti, you guys were absolutely essential, and this 2-year journey with you all has been, the most important professional development opportunity in my whole career. So thank you so much. And lastly, to all of the brilliant farmers, their families, and the adorable cows that contributed to my feelings and to this body of work over time. It's just been a really remarkable experience, and I've learned a lot. So without any other delays, I know we're short on time, but I would love to take any questions if there are any from the audience.
Okay, so thank you, Anthony. Thanks to everyone. So Gary has a question. Gary, do you want to go ahead and speak, or shall I read for you?
I can ask. Nice job, Anthony. Appreciated your presentation. You talked a little bit about these illegal limits, levels, and what infrastructure really exists to enforce any of that? And I assume that's only in the marketplace when a sale is occurring?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that is one of the biggest challenges of navigating regulatory climate in smallholder food systems, is that the only real infrastructure for enforcing these regulations would be at markets, and particularly in export markets or governmentally regulated markets. And so at the smallholder level, there really is no infrastructure for evaluating or enforcing these regulations. And that is actually one of the major drivers of this research, trying to extend interventions into communities that are almost completely underserved by regulatory infrastructure, because it is such a dismal situation. I think India in general is now really taking aflatoxins more seriously. I hope that the regulatory landscape will be advancing in India rather quickly.
Thanks, Anthony. I might just sneak in another quick question. Is there any interest there in the AflaSafe biocontrol technology that's being very successful in Africa? Is it being looked at there?
Yeah. So I actually just last year met with Ranajit in New Delhi, and he's very interested in getting AflaSafe established in India. I mean, he is Indian himself, and he is invested in it. And he was, one of the developers of that technology. And so while now it hasn't been widespread, there is certainly vested interest in it. And I expect that within the next few years, the first manufacturing facilities and distribution outlets will be opened in India.
Thank you.
So there's some nice tributes showing up on the chat. But if anybody has any questions, given the number of people on the line, I think it'll be easiest if you chat in just at least your name to say that you have a question or any indication that you want to ask something, so that I can highlight that. I might see your hand go up, but my screen is not showing the whole picture there. Yeah, or else just feel free to unmute or request to unmute, and I will also use that as a chance to give you a tap. Any other questions or comments for Anthony? Okay, Becky Stolzfus is asking, an impressive range of research. How confident are you that your findings are generalizable to the next year or the next given secular trends, or next village maybe given secular trends? So, Anthony?
Yeah. Well, that is a great question. And of course, it is well known that dynamics in aflatoxin contamination are wildly variable year to year, as determined by local climates and production contexts. But I think one thing that I've really tried to focus on in my research is identifying those things that are stable over time. And while the levels of aflatoxins or fumonisins might be variable year to year, I think the important learnings as far as the nature of risk in a given locality and the intervention options that might be useful are certainly generalizable year to year. But it is certainly something that is a limitation of this work. And ideally, this sort of longitudinal surveillance would be done over several years to try to account for that year-to-year variation.
Okay, so I would just like to wedge in a thanks to Becky. She was on our international nutrition faculty at Cornell at the start of Anthony's work, but has since transitioned, and now she's the president of Goshen College in Indiana. And so we really appreciate your staying on the committee, and that's, I think, a nice tribute to Anthony in itself. So next, Marina Mann has a question. After saying great talk, question, you mentioned that a surprisingly small number of farmers actually ended up buying sacks. Indeed, we were shocked. Do you think this could be in part because farmers don't see their grains as money, but rather as food, and thus paying for food they already grew is not a good investment? Their inner value of the grain is not in terms of money? Yeah, so any comment on
that's
that?
A very, very
willingness,
interesting.
Nominal willingness to pay and actual not willingness to pay. Yeah, very, very striking observation. And your comment, please. I was saying, Marina has reworded it. Do you think farmers are willing to exchange grain for sacks instead of cash for sacks? And that was Saeed's variation on the question. But yeah, that's a really great point. Anthony?
Yeah. That is a really good question, because I think you're in saying that they don't see their grains necessarily as money or something with transactive value, but rather as food. But I think that grain is the major source of livelihood and income for these communities. And so at least from what I've observed, the distinction between grain for money and grain for food is not really there, because farmers have a set amount of grain and devote it to different end uses as per their needs. So do I think farmers are willing to exchange grain for sacks? I would say it depends on how much grain. I don't think they would exchange a sack's worth of grain for one sack. But I think to get at the heart of your question is how else can we incentivize their investment? And I think this is something that Rebecca and I have also been talking about, is like, what are alternatives to just outright buying them on the market? And I think that instead of an exchange, a swap of grain for sacks, one thing that Rebecca and I have been talking about is the opportunity of like a risk-free rental. I think farmers would be very keen to take sacks out on a rental basis or pay a small fee to rent sacks if they would have the promise of getting that money back. So I think that there are certainly other ways to transact and commoditize these intervention opportunities that have yet to be explored. But I don't know if I can say definitively whether farmers would generally distinguish between grain as food or money. But very good question.
We have now exhausted our hour, and I wanted to really thank everyone for being here. Now 42 people on the line, and a really active Q&A. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Anthony, for a great presentation. Thank you, Prabhu and TCI, and thank you to Anthony's committee for great guidance throughout. We look forward to a B exam coming up soon. So thanks, everybody, and best wishes. Hope you're staying safe and sane at this very weird time of our lives. Take care.
Yeah, thanks to all. It was a pleasure.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.